The Garage Door. War, a Sweetwater Ridge saga. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the perfectly manicured lawns of Sweetwater Ridge, a planned community where conformity wasn't just encouraged. It was enforced with the zealous dedication of religious fundamentalists. Evan Collins stood in his driveway, garage door remote clutched in his sweaty palm, completely unaware that the next 60 seconds would transform his quiet suburban life into a months-long battle that would make national headlines, destroy long-standing friendships, expose corruption within the homeowners association, and ultimately reveal the dark psychological underpinnings of modern suburban power structures. Sweetwater Ridge was the kind of neighborhood that appeared in real estate brochures with smiling families and golden retrievers posed artfully on emerald lawns. Every house was painted in one of 3 approved colors: desert sand, a beige so bland it seemed designed to induce mild depression, sage whisper, a green so pale it barely qualified as a color, or morning dove, a gray that managed to be both boring and pretentious simultaneously. The mailboxes were identical black metal posts with brass numbers positioned exactly 42 inches from the sidewalk. Not 41, not 43, but precisely 42, as mandated by Section 3.7 of the Sweetwater Ridge Architectural Guidelines. Even the trees were strategically placed according to a master plan developed by a landscape architect who had clearly never met a tree he couldn't regulate. 1 oak, 1 maple, 1 flowering dogwood per front yard, planted exactly 12 feet from the sidewalk and spaced no closer than 18 feet apart. The effect was suburban paradise, assuming paradise came with a 40-page covenant document, monthly inspections, and a homeowners association board that wielded power like medieval lords presiding over a kingdom of grass clippings and garage sales. Evan had moved here 5 years ago with his wife Lisa and their daughter Sarah, then 9 years old and blissfully unaware that neighborhoods could be militarized zones disguised as family-friendly communities. They'd been drawn by the promise of safety, community involvement, and steadily rising property values that would secure their financial future. The HOA fees seemed reasonable at first, just $200 a month for landscaping maintenance, private security patrols, and what the marketing materials euphemistically called community enhancement initiatives. What they hadn't anticipated was that community enhancement would evolve into an Orwellian nightmare of surveillance, petty regulations, and neighbors turned against neighbors in service of some twisted vision of residential perfection that seemed designed more to eliminate human individuality than to preserve property values. The trouble had been brewing for months, like a pressure cooker slowly building steam, ever since Karen Fitzgerald orchestrated what local residents would later refer to as the coup. She had systematically undermined the previous HOA president, a mild-mannered retired teacher named Bob Patterson, through a campaign of whispered accusations, strategic alliance building, and the kind of bureaucratic maneuvering that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. Karen was a tall, sharp-featured woman in her early 50s who carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who had spent years in corporate middle management before discovering that homeowners association politics offered unlimited opportunities for wielding authority over people who couldn't quit or transfer to different departments. She wore her position as vice president like expensive perfume, impossible to ignore and slightly overwhelming to everyone in her vicinity. She lived in the largest house on Maple Drive, a 2-story colonial with white columns that she'd somehow gotten approved despite violating at least 3 architectural guidelines. The house featured custom stonework, premium siding, and landscaping that exceeded the association's own spending limits for individual properties. But rules, as Evan had learned through painful experience, were flexible instruments that could be bent, ignored, or selectively enforced depending on who was being regulated and who was doing the regulating. Karen's latest acquisition was parked in her driveway like a declaration of war against every neighbor who drove anything less impressive. A midnight blue BMW X5, fresh from the dealership with temporary tags still taped to the rear window, and a manufacturer's sticker price that exceeded most residents' annual salaries. She'd bought it 3 days ago and had already mentioned it in 2 separate HOA email blasts describing how it elevated the aesthetic standards of our community and encouraging other residents to consider the visual impact of their vehicle choices on neighborhood property values. The car sat precisely 8 inches from the edge of her driveway, positioned with mathematical precision that suggested she'd actually measured the distance with a ruler. Any closer, and it would technically be parked on HOA common property, which would violate her own regulations. Any further back, and it wouldn't be visible from the street, and visibility was clearly the entire point. Karen wanted everyone to see her success, her compliance with some unwritten standard of suburban achievement that she herself had established. This was the toxic environment that had been festering for months when Evan made the fateful decision to press the button on his garage remote that Friday afternoon in late June. The button itself was nothing special. A gray plastic rectangle with 3 colored buttons that had been included with the garage door opener when they'd moved in. The device had been manufactured by Chamberlain, model number 374 UT, and had faithfully performed its simple function thousands of times over the past 5 years. Evan had no reason to suspect that this particular button press would be any different from the previous thousands. He pressed the button. The old motor groaned to life, gears grinding with the mechanical symphony that had become the soundtrack to his weekend routines. The sound echoed off the houses across the street, a mundane noise that typically attracted no more attention than a dog barking or a lawnmower starting up. But today, it would trigger an avalanche of accusations, police reports, legal proceedings, and neighborhood drama that would consume his life for the next 8 months. The garage door rose with its usual grinding reluctance, revealing the organized chaos of suburban storage. Camping equipment from optimistic family trips that had never quite matched the catalog photos, tools purchased for home improvement projects that remained stubbornly unimproved, cardboard boxes labeled Christmas decorations, and Sarah's school papers in Lisa's careful handwriting, and Sarah's outgrown bicycle, now relegated to the corner like a monument to childhood's rapid passage. "Excuse me!" The voice cut through the humid air like a knife through butter, sharp and demanding, and loaded with enough righteous indignation to power a small generator. Karen Fitzgerald stood on the sidewalk in front of her house, arms crossed in the universal posture of someone who had appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner of neighborhood standards. She wore pressed khaki slacks that had been ironed with military precision and a pastel pink blouse that somehow managed to look both professional and aggressive simultaneously. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun that seemed designed to stretch the skin around her eyes, giving her the appearance of someone perpetually surprised by other people's failures to meet her exacting standards. "Is that your car?" she demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at the BMW with the theatrical flair of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Evan blinked, genuinely confused by both the question and the tone of voice in which it had been delivered. He followed her pointing finger to the BMW, which sat exactly where it had been sitting for the past 3 days, gleaming in the afternoon sun like a very expensive blue jewel. "No," he replied, his voice carrying the cautious tone of someone who suspected they had stumbled into a trap but couldn't quite identify its nature. "That's your car." Karen's eyes narrowed into thin slits, and for a moment she studied his face with the intensity of a forensic analyst examining evidence at a crime scene. Her mouth twitched with the barely controlled energy of someone who had been waiting for this moment, planning for it, perhaps even fantasizing about it during those long nights when normal people were sleeping instead of scheming. "Then why," she said, her voice rising to a volume that could probably be heard 3 houses away, "are you opening your garage while staring directly at it?" The question hung in the air like an accusation of witchcraft. Evan found himself looking around the neighborhood, hoping for some sign that other people were witnessing this surreal exchange, that he wasn't trapped in some kind of fever dream brought on by too much afternoon sun and suburban ennui. "I wasn't staring at it," he said carefully. "I was just opening my garage, like I do every Saturday, to get my lawnmower." "That's exactly what someone who was planning to steal my car would say," Karen replied with the triumphant tone of someone who believed they had just solved a particularly complex puzzle. She reached into her designer handbag, a leather creation that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments, and pulled out her iPhone with the precision of a gunslinger drawing a weapon in a Western movie. The phone was encased in a protective cover that looked like it could survive a nuclear attack, which seemed appropriate given Karen's personality. "I'm calling 911, she announced loudly enough that every dog in a 3-block radius probably heard her. "Wait, what?" Evan stepped forward, genuinely concerned now that his neighbor might be experiencing some kind of medical emergency. "Karen, are you feeling all right? Do you need me to call someone?" "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice reaching a pitch that probably disturbed wildlife in the nearby nature preserve. "Don't come any closer!" Windows began opening up and down the street like flowers blooming in fast-forward motion. Mrs. Henderson from across the street peered out from behind her lace curtains, her elderly face creased with concern. The Johnson family's teenage son paused in the middle of washing his Honda Civic to stare at the unfolding drama. Even Mr. Chen looked up from his meticulously maintained rose bushes, pruning shears still clutched in his gloved hands, his expression shifting from confusion to fascination. Karen was already dialing, her manicured fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. When the dispatcher answered, her voice took on the breathless quality of someone reporting a genuine, life-threatening emergency. "Yes, 911? I need police immediately," she said, her free hand gesturing dramatically as if the dispatcher could see her performance. "There's a man attempting to steal my car. He's been conducting surveillance on my property, and he's using his garage door as some kind of diversionary tactic." Evan's heart began racing, not with the adrenaline of criminal activity, but with the panicked confusion of someone who had suddenly found themselves cast as the villain in a play they had never auditioned for. He looked around desperately, hoping that someone, anyone, would step forward and explain to Karen that opening garage doors was not, in fact, a federal crime. But his neighbors seemed content to watch from the safety of their own properties, many of them now openly filming the proceedings with their phones. This was clearly going to be premium content for Nextdoor, Facebook, and whatever other social media platforms suburban residents used to document the daily dramas of planned community life. "Ma'am, what's your address?" he heard the dispatcher ask. Karen rattled off her street address with the efficiency of someone who had memorized it for exactly this purpose, then launched into an increasingly elaborate description of Evan's alleged criminal enterprise. "He's been loitering in his driveway for at least 20 minutes, she continued, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of an expert witness testifying before Congress. "He was studying my vehicle, clearly assessing its value and security features. I purchased it 3 days ago from BMW of Riverside. It's a 2023 X5 in mineral blue metallic with the premium package. The MSRP is $63,400, which makes this a felony-level theft attempt." Evan felt his mouth drop open. 20 minutes? He had been outside for perhaps 90 seconds and studying her car? He couldn't have identified the make and model of Karen's car if his life depended on it, despite living across the street from it for 3 days. "These people know exactly when we make expensive purchases," Karen continued, apparently warming to her theme. "They watch us, they study our routines, they wait for the perfect moment to strike." "These people," Evan repeated. But Karen was in full theatrical mode now, playing to an audience of 911 dispatchers, gathering neighbors, and whatever social media followers would eventually watch the inevitable video recordings. "He opened his garage door as a signal," she explained with the confidence of someone who had just cracked the Da Vinci Code. "Probably to accomplices waiting around the corner. This is clearly a sophisticated operation. They've been planning this for weeks, maybe months." The absurdity of it all would have been hilarious if not for the fact that actual police officers were presumably racing through traffic at this very moment, sirens wailing, emergency lights flashing, all because a suburban housewife had decided that garage door operation constituted criminal conspiracy. Evan tried desperately to inject some sanity into the proceedings. "Karen," he said, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone trying to talk a potential jumper down from a ledge. "I live here. We've been neighbors for 5 years. You know my wife, Lisa. She's on the library committee with you. You know my daughter, Sarah. She babysits for the Hendersons sometimes. I coach Little League Baseball with your husband, Tom. Karen's face twisted into an expression of pure disdain. "I don't know anything about you," she snapped. "And Tom isn't my husband. He's the HOA president. The fact that you can't even keep basic facts straight just proves that you're not thinking clearly. You're probably high on drugs." "I'm not," Evans started, but Karen had turned her attention back to her phone conversation. "The suspect is becoming increasingly agitated," she reported to the dispatcher, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone providing expert analysis. "He's making wild claims, trying to manipulate the situation with false information. I think he might be under the influence of controlled substances. His eyes look glassy and unfocused." Evan caught his reflection in the side mirror of a parked car. His eyes looked exactly as they always did, perhaps a little wider than usual due to shock and disbelief, but certainly not glassy. He had consumed exactly one beer with lunch while watching the baseball game, and that had been over 2 hours ago. He was probably more sober than he had been in weeks. The wail of sirens began in the distance, growing steadily louder as the cavalry approached to deal with the great garage door crime of Sweetwater Ridge. Karen's smile widened with each passing second, the expression of someone who had just played a winning hand in a high-stakes poker game. "They're almost here," she announced with satisfaction. "Don't even think about trying to run." "I'm not going to run," Evan shouted, his patience finally reaching its breaking point. "This is absolutely insane. You're completely out of your mind." "And now he's making verbal threats," Karen reported to the dispatcher without missing a beat. "I'm genuinely afraid for my safety. Please tell the responding officers that the suspect has become hostile and aggressive." The first police cruiser rounded the corner like something out of an action movie, emergency lights painting the neat suburban landscape in alternating red and blue. It was followed immediately by a second unit, then a third, creating a convoy of law enforcement that Sweetwater Ridge typically didn't see in an entire month. 6 police officers emerged from the vehicles, all wearing the alert expressions of people who had been told they were responding to a potential felony in progress. Officer Martinez, whom Evan recognized from various community events and school presentations, approached with his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Sir," Martinez said in the authoritative tone that police officers learn in their first week of training, "I need you to step away from the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them." "It's not my vehicle," Evan replied, raising his hands in the universal gesture of surrender. "It's hers. I was just opening my garage to get my lawnmower." "That's exactly what he wants you to think," Karen interjected smoothly. She had positioned herself behind the officers like a general commanding troops from a safe distance. "He's been preparing for this theft for weeks. I have documentation." With the dramatic flair of a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat, she produced a manila folder from her handbag. Who carried manila folders in their purse as standard equipment? This level of preparation suggested that Karen had been planning this confrontation for some time. She began shuffling through papers with practiced efficiency, extracting photographs and what appeared to be a typed report, complete with dates, times, and detailed observations. "I've been keeping meticulous records of suspicious activity in the neighborhood," she explained to Officer Martinez, her voice taking on the professional tone of someone presenting evidence to a jury. On Tuesday, June 18th, at exactly 3:47 p.m., he opened his garage door just as I was arriving home from Whole Foods with groceries. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Officer Martinez examined the photographs with the weary expression of a man who had dealt with HOA disputes before and knew exactly where this was heading. On Wednesday, June 19th, at 9:23 a.m., he was standing in his driveway when I left for my yoga class, Karen continued, warming to her presentation. He watched my car back out of the driveway and tracked its movement down the street. Classic surveillance behavior. The photographs were surprisingly professional quality, taken with what must have been a high-powered camera equipped with a telephoto lens. They showed Evan engaged in various mundane activities, checking his mailbox, talking to Mrs. Henderson across the street, loading groceries into his car, walking his dog. Yesterday, June 20th, at 6:15 p.m., I caught him looking directly at my car while pretending to inspect his mailbox, Karen concluded with the satisfaction of someone who had just presented an airtight case. The pattern is absolutely clear. This has been a systematic surveillance operation designed to identify the optimal moment for theft. Officer Martinez studied the documentation with growing bewilderment. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "these photographs appear to show normal neighborhood activities. People do tend to see each other occasionally when they live in close proximity." "Not like this," Karen insisted, her voice taking on the passionate intensity of someone defending a religious belief. "This isn't casual neighborly interaction. This is predatory behavior, pattern recognition." He was clearly casing my property and studying my routines. A second officer, a young woman with Rodriguez on her name tag, was conducting her own investigation of the BMW. She walked around the vehicle slowly, examining the doors, windows, and locks with the thoroughness of a crime scene investigator. "Ma'am," Rodriguez called out, "do you have the keys to this vehicle?" "Of course I have the keys," Karen replied, producing them from her purse with a flourish. She pressed the unlock button, and the BMW chirped obligingly, its lights flashing in mechanical acknowledgement of her ownership. "And, sir," Rodriguez turned to Evan, "do you have any connection to this vehicle? Any reason you might have been interested in it?" "Absolutely none," Evan said emphatically. "I drive a 2019 Honda Civic. It's in my garage, right behind me. Would you like to see it? I can show you the registration, insurance papers, whatever you need." "That's all part of his cover story," Karen protested before Rodriguez could respond. "Of course he has a decoy vehicle. Real criminals aren't stupid. They plan these things out in advance." Officer Martinez was beginning to look visibly annoyed, his professional patience wearing thin in the face of Karen's increasingly elaborate theories. "Ma'am," he said, with the controlled tone of someone trying very hard to remain polite, "what exactly did you observe this gentleman do to your car?" Karen paused, apparently realizing that this was the crucial question that would either validate her emergency call or expose her as someone who had wasted significant police resources on a suburban fantasy. He opened his garage door while looking in the direction of my car," she said finally. "And then what happened? And then, well, that's when I called you." "So he didn't actually touch your car?" "No, but he didn't attempt to enter your car." "No, but that's because he didn't take anything from your car." "No, but you have to understand, ma'am," Officer Martinez interrupted. "What you're describing is not a crime. Opening a garage door on your own property is not illegal. Looking in the direction of a neighbor's car is not illegal. Even if someone were planning to steal a car, thinking about committing a crime is not itself a crime unless there are specific actions taken toward carrying out that plan." Karen's face was beginning to redden, the flush of someone who was realizing that their brilliant strategy was falling apart under professional scrutiny. "But I know what I saw," she insisted. "I know criminal behavior when I see it." "With respect, ma'am," Rodriguez interjected diplomatically. "What you saw was a neighbor opening his garage door. That's not criminal behavior, that's Saturday afternoon behavior." The crowd of neighbors had grown considerably during the police investigation. What had started as casual curiosity had evolved into full-scale entertainment, with residents openly gathering on sidewalks and front porches to watch the proceedings. Several people were obviously recording with their phones, creating what would undoubtedly become the most watched next-door video in Sweetwater Ridge history. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman from across the street, had grown bold enough to venture into speaking distance of the officers. "Officer," she called out in her clear, carrying voice, "Evan is a lovely man. He's lived here for 5 years. He helps me with my groceries every week. This is absolutely ridiculous." "Thank you, ma'am," Martinez replied politely. "That woman," Mrs. Henderson continued, pointing directly at Karen, "has been causing problems in this neighborhood for months. She calls the police constantly. Last week she reported my grandson for suspicious loitering because he was waiting for his Uber in my driveway." Other neighbors began chiming in, apparently emboldened by Mrs. Henderson's willingness to speak publicly. "She called animal control on my dog for aggressive barking," announced Jim Patterson from 2 houses down. "My dog is a golden retriever. He's never been aggressive to anyone in his entire life. She reported me to code enforcement for having an unauthorized garden gnome," added Maria Santos. "It was 6 inches tall and sitting behind my rose bushes." The officers exchanged meaningful glances. This was clearly not their first encounter with Karen Fitzgerald's interpretation of community safety. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said to Karen, "I need to ask you directly. Are you certain you want to file an official police report claiming that this man attempted to steal your car?" Karen hesitated for the first time since the entire drama had begun. Evan could see the wheels turning in her head, probably calculating the potential legal ramifications of filing a false police report versus the political implications of backing down in front of the entire neighborhood. "I want to file a complaint about suspicious activity," she said finally, apparently deciding that a strategic retreat was preferable to a complete surrender. "That's different from reporting an attempted theft," Martinez pointed out. "Suspicious activity reports are for documenting concerns that don't rise to the level of actual crimes." "Fine," Karen said through gritted teeth. "Suspicious activity. Though I should mention," Rodriguez added helpfully, "that if we receive repeated reports about the same person with no evidence of actual wrongdoing, that could potentially be considered harassment, which is itself a crime." Karen's eyes flashed with indignation. "Are you threatening me?" "We're informing you of the law, ma'am," Martinez replied evenly, "just as we would inform any citizen about the potential consequences of their actions." The documentation process took another 30 minutes, during which time the crowd of neighbors continued to grow and the pile of evidence continued to mount, not against Evan, but against Karen's credibility. Residents who had been intimidated by her HOA authority for months were finally finding their voices, sharing stories of her previous calls to law enforcement over increasingly trivial matters. Tom Brewster, the actual HOA president and Karen's long-suffering husband, eventually arrived on the scene after apparently being summoned from their backyard where he'd been grilling burgers in blissful ignorance of his wife's latest crusade. "What's going on here?" Tom asked, looking mortified as he took in the scene. 6 police officers, a crowd of neighbors, and his wife holding court like a prosecutor at a high-profile trial. "Your wife called 911 because I opened my garage door," Evan explained with the weary patience of someone who had been explaining the same absurd situation for over an hour. Tom's face went through several interesting color changes as he processed this information. As HOA president, he was presumably familiar with the kinds of complaints that generated emergency police responses, and garage door operation was definitely not on that list. "Karen," he said carefully, "what are you talking about?" "Don't take his side," Karen snapped, apparently viewing her husband's confusion as betrayal. "As HOA president, you should be supporting efforts to maintain community safety and security." "Opening garage doors is not a safety issue," Tom replied with the firm tone of someone who had reached the end of his patience. "Karen, you need to apologize to these officers and to Evan." "I will not apologize for protecting our community," Karen declared with the righteous indignation of someone who genuinely believed she was fighting the good fight. The officers spent another 20 minutes taking statements and writing reports, primarily to satisfy Karen's demand for official documentation of her complaints. Neighbors gradually began drifting back to their Saturday afternoon activities, though many lingered on their porches and in their yards, clearly hoping for additional drama. Finally, the police cars pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a neighborhood that had been fundamentally changed by an hour of suburban theater. The silence that followed their departure felt strange and heavy, like the aftermath of a thunderstorm. "I'm really sorry about this," Tom said quietly to Evan after Karen had stalked back to their house in obvious frustration. "She's been stressed lately." "Stressed about what?" Evan asked. "The HOA board elections are coming up next month," Tom explained with obvious reluctance. "She's been worried about keeping her position as vice president. Some residents have been circulating a petition to impose term limits on board members." That explained everything. Karen wasn't just a neighbor with control issues. She was a politician facing potential unemployment, and she was lashing out at anyone she perceived as a threat to her authority. But if Evan thought the incident was over, He was about to discover that Karen Fitzgerald was just getting started. By Sunday morning, every resident of Sweetwater Ridge had received an email from the HOA with the subject line, "Urgent Security Alert. Attempted vehicle theft thwarted by vigilant community member." The email, clearly written by Karen in her capacity as Vice President, transformed the previous day's events into an epic tale of heroism and community vigilance. In her version of events, she had identified and disrupted a sophisticated theft operation through her quick thinking and decisive action. Evan was described as a suspicious individual who had been conducting systematic surveillance activities throughout the neighborhood and utilizing deceptive practices to mask his criminal intentions. The email warned all residents to be alert for unusual garage door activity, coordinated theft attempts, and individuals who attempt to blend in with normal neighborhood activities while conducting reconnaissance. The email also announced a series of new, enhanced security protocols, including recommendations that all residents install security cameras and motion sensors, avoid leaving vehicles unattended for extended periods, and report any suspicious behavior immediately to both the HOA board and local law enforcement. As a temporary emergency measure, the email continued, all garage doors in Sweetwater Ridge would be subject to new operating restrictions. Residents would be required to register their garage door remote controls with the HOA office and provide advance notice of any non-routine garage access. Additionally, all garage doors would need to be equipped with enhanced security features, including backup cameras and motion sensors, with installation costs to be covered by individual homeowners. Evan's phone started ringing before he had finished reading the email. His wife Lisa, who was visiting her mother in Portland, wanted to know why her neighbor Mrs. Chen had called to ask if everything was okay at home. His daughter Sarah, away at summer camp, had received worried texts from high school friends whose parents were next-door subscribers. "Dad," Sarah said when she managed to get through on the phone, "Mom said the HOA people were kind of intense, but this sounds completely crazy. What did you actually do?" "I opened our garage door," Evan replied. "That's it? That's it?" There was a long pause while Sarah processed this information. "Okay, but what did you do before that? Or after that?" "Nothing. I literally just pressed the button on the garage door remote." Another pause. "Dad, I think you might be living in a neighborhood full of insane people." The accuracy of that assessment became increasingly clear over the following days as the story took on a life of its own in the viral ecosystem of suburban social media. The Nextdoor app, which had previously featured discussions about lost cats and recommendations for lawn care services, exploded with neighbors taking increasingly extreme positions on what was being called the incident. Some residents supported Karen's vigilance, praising her for taking a proactive stance against crime and refusing to be a passive victim in the face of obvious criminal activity. Others were openly mocking the situation, posting memes about dangerous garage doors, creating satirical garage door safety tips, and forming a Facebook group called Sweetwater Ridge Garage Door Watch, where members shared photos of themselves opening their own garage doors with captions like, "Caught me red-handed," and "Call 911. I'm about to commit a garage door crime." The story spread beyond Sweetwater Ridge when someone uploaded cell phone footage of the police response to YouTube. The video, titled "Karen Calls Cops on Neighbor for Opening Garage Door," received over 100,000 views in its first week and spawned dozens of reaction videos and commentary pieces. But Karen was far from finished with her campaign. If anything, the online attention seemed to validate her conviction that she was fighting an important battle against the forces of suburban crime and disorder. Tuesday brought a formal legal notice from the HOA's attorney, delivered by certified mail to Evan's door. The envelope contained a multi-page document charging him with violating numerous community covenants. Section 4.7. Engaging in activities that disturb the peace and quiet enjoyment of other residents. Section 6.2. Failure to maintain appropriate neighborly conduct. Section 8.1. creating conditions that may negatively impact community property values. Section 12.3. Operating mechanical equipment in a manner inconsistent with community standards. Section 15.6. Engaging in behavior that brings unwanted attention to the community. The letter demanded that Evan appear before the HOA board at their next scheduled meeting to defend his actions and face appropriate sanctions for his violations of community standards. Potential penalties included fines up to $500 per violation, mandatory installation of enhanced security measures at his own expense, and other remedial actions up to and including legal proceedings to compel the sale of his property and removal from Sweetwater Ridge. Evan read the document 3 times before its implications fully sank in. He was being formally prosecuted by his own neighborhood association for the crime of opening his garage door on his own property. Lisa returned from Portland that evening to find Evan hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts of HOA bylaws, legal precedents, and property law cases. "This is completely insane," she said after reading the legal notice. Can they actually do this? Can they really force us to sell our house?" "According to what I'm reading," Evan replied grimly, "they can try. HOAs have remarkably broad authority to enforce community standards. The question is whether opening a garage door constitutes a violation of community standards that justifies this level of response. It's Karen, isn't it? She's orchestrating this whole thing. She's definitely the driving force, but the entire board had to approve sending this legal notice. That means Tom signed off on it, along with the other 3 board members." Lisa sat down across from him at the kitchen table. "So, what do we do?" "I guess we get a lawyer." The process of hiring legal representation for a garage door dispute felt surreal, but Evan quickly discovered that HOA conflicts were a thriving area of legal practice. He eventually retained Margaret Flynn, an attorney in her 60s who had specialized in homeowners association law for over 20 years. "I've seen cases like this before," Margaret told Evan during their first consultation in her downtown office. "Board members who let a little bit of power go to their heads and start treating their neighbors like subjects in their personal kingdom. The good news is that when HOAs overreach this badly, they usually provide enough evidence to hang themselves. What's the bad news? It can take months or even years to resolve, depending on how stubborn they are. And it's going to cost you several $1,000s in legal fees before we're done." Margaret's strategy was methodical and thorough. Document everything, gather witness statements from neighbors, research the background and motivations of the complainants, and prepare to demonstrate that Karen's actions were motivated by personal animus and political calculation, rather than legitimate community concerns. The key is establishing a pattern of harassment," Margaret explained as she reviewed the case materials. "One incident might be dismissed as a misunderstanding or overzealous community policing. But if we can prove that this is part of a broader campaign of intimidation and abuse of authority, the board will be forced to distance themselves from Mrs. Fitzgerald or risk serious legal liability." As if she had been scripted by Margaret's legal team, Karen proceeded to provide exactly the evidence they needed. Over the next 2 weeks, she filed additional complaints against Evan with remarkable creativity and persistence. His daughter's car was allegedly parked at an inappropriate angle in the driveway, creating a visual disruption to neighborhood symmetry. His garbage cans were left at the curb for 17 minutes past the designated pickup time, constituting willful disregard for community standards. His lawn sprinklers were operating during inappropriate hours, 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, creating noise pollution during designated quiet periods. His home security cameras were allegedly positioned to monitor common areas without proper authorization. He was walking his dog on the incorrect side of the street, violating pedestrian traffic protocols that existed only in Karen's imagination. Each complaint came with professionally shot photographs, precise timestamps, detailed written descriptions, and demands for immediate corrective action. Karen was building a case against Evan, but she was also building evidence of her own obsessive and potentially mentally unstable behavior. The complaints became increasingly bizarre and personal. She claimed that Evan's choice of lawn fertilizer was creating olfactory disturbances that interfered with her peaceful enjoyment of outdoor spaces. She reported that his habit of checking his mailbox at 4:30 p.m. was clearly designed to coincide with her afternoon meditation schedule and constituted intentional psychological harassment. Most damning of all, she began filing complaints against Evan's wife and daughter for activities that had occurred before the original garage door incident. Apparently, Karen had been maintaining surveillance files on the entire Collins family for months, documenting their comings and goings with the thoroughness of a private investigator. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for the third Thursday of July to be held in the Community Center conference room at 7 p.m. Evan arrived with Margaret and 4 neighbors who had volunteered to testify on his behalf. He expected a modest crowd of perhaps 20 residents, the usual suspects who attended monthly meetings to complain about snow removal or argue about playground maintenance. Instead, he found nearly 150 people packed into a room designed for 40, with an overflow crowd spilling into the hallway and onto the community center's front lawn. Folding chairs had been borrowed from 3 different churches. The local cable access channel had sent a camera crew. 2 newspaper reporters were taking notes. Someone had even set up a live stream on Facebook that was attracting viewers from around the country. This was no longer a simple HOA dispute. It had become a media event, a symbol of suburban authoritarianism run amok. Karen sat at the board table wearing a navy blue suit that made her look like a prosecutor preparing for a capital punishment case. She had apparently spent considerable time and money preparing for this presentation. A professional quality projection system had been installed, complete with wireless presentation remote and laser pointer. She had prepared what appeared to be a 40-slide PowerPoint presentation, complete with aerial photographs of the entire neighborhood, timeline charts showing Evan's suspicious activities, enlarged photographs of his house from multiple angles, and what looked like a psychological profile complete with bullet-pointed behavioral indicators. Tom Brewster, as HOA President, called the meeting to order with the obvious reluctance of a man who would rather be literally anywhere else on Earth. He looked like someone who had aged 10 years in the past month, and who was beginning to realize that his marriage to Karen had made him complicit in a situation that was spiraling completely out of control. We're here tonight to address the formal complaints filed by Vice President Fitzgerald regarding alleged covenant violations by resident Evan Collins. Tom began, reading from prepared remarks with the enthusiasm of someone reciting a grocery list. Mrs. Fitzgerald will present the association's case, followed by Mr. Collins and his legal representation. Karen stood and activated her presentation system with obvious satisfaction. The first slide filled the wall-mounted screen. Protecting our community, a comprehensive analysis of systematic security threats and appropriate responses. For the next hour and 15 minutes, Karen presented what could only be described as the manifesto of someone who had devoted considerable time and energy to documenting another person's daily routine. She had photographs of Evan leaving for work, returning from work, getting his mail, taking out his garbage, walking his dog, washing his car, talking to neighbors, and, yes, opening his garage door. She had researched property values in comparable neighborhoods and created elaborate charts demonstrating how security incidents could impact home prices. She had obtained crime statistics for the broader metropolitan area and highlighted vehicle thefts in particular, somehow connecting this data to Evan's garage door usage. She had even commissioned what appeared to be a psychological evaluation of Evan's behavior patterns, complete with references to academic studies on criminal surveillance techniques and pre-crime behavioral indicators. The presentation included analysis of his suspicious timing patterns, his calculated attempts to appear normal, and his use of family members and pets as cover for reconnaissance activities. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable, Karen concluded, her voice carrying the passionate intensity of someone delivering a closing argument to a jury. Mr. Collins has engaged in a systematic campaign of surveillance and intimidation directed at my property and my person. While he may not have completed the criminal acts he was obviously planning, we cannot and must not wait for actual crimes to occur before taking decisive action. Prevention and proactive community protection must be our highest priorities. The room was absolutely silent when she finished. Evan could hear the air conditioning system cycling on and off, the distant sound of traffic from the main road, and what sounded like someone in the back.